I've been wanting to tackle this topic for a while. I asked you guys if you had any suggestions for it, what your most hated writing advice was, and I got a lot of good suggestions, so I have quite a list of the most common writing advice that I don't like, and apparently neither do you, and why I think this advice is just not great. So let's just get right into it. One of the first things that came up was, of course, just anybody who tells you that the way to write a book is to do this thing. Some examples that you guys mentioned were to write every day, to have a certain kind of plot template, to start with a messy first draft, to fill out personality charts about your characters before you start writing. There were a lot of different ones, but anybody who says this is the way that you write a book, there's no one way to write a book. With all the writers that I've known, I'm in fact amazed at how often they have some kind of crazy process. I've met people who do like a zero draft that's all dialogue first. I've met people who write the whole thing like in a notebook longhand first. I've known people who write the whole first draft and then they don't look at it and they rewrite it from memory. There are truly as many different processes as there are writers. Everybody has their own individual process. It doesn't hurt to know what other people's processes are and how they do it and why it works for them, and to kind of like mix it up. Like, I know some author tubers do those, like, I followed so-and-so's writing routine for a day. And while that might be something you probably wouldn't do unless you were going to make a clickbait YouTube video about it. Nevertheless, there's something to be said for trying different things, especially if what you're currently doing is not working. You might want to try something else and see if it does work. But with that said, there is no one way to do things. In fact, the only advice that I would give to every single writer out there is to try different things and find your own process. That's like the only universal advice I can think of that truly applies to every writer ever. Because of course you have to find your own process. Now, with that said, let's get into some more specific advice that is very common. Show, don't tell. This is a super common one. It is the first chapter, I believe, in Self-Editing for Fiction Writers, which is a great book on writing that I have recommended before, and you can find a link in my Amazon link in my bio. And they explain it very well in the book. It's basically like, you don't want to tell people what the character is feeling, or just say, like, you don't want to tell people how to feel. You don't want to explain things that aren't necessary to the plot. You want to just show things. In the book, they also note it as resist the urge to explain. Like, you don't want to say, she felt sad. You want to show her dialogue that would have let you guess how she might feel, or her actions. But with that said, I think that this has led to a lot of inadvertently not that great writing. For example, there's a lot of books, I've talked about it before, it's a gripe of mine, there's a lot of physical reactions in books to a degree that can be somewhat absurd. Her stomach clenched, her teeth ground, her heart raced faster. That, I think, often comes from that, like, oh, I'm not going to tell them she was scared. I'm going to show, like, oh, I'm feeling it in my body. But instead, you just get this, like, crazy mess of beating hearts and fluttering stomachs and, like, forehead tension and, like, physical reactions, of which there are only so many that you can do. The other thing that bothers me about this is that I think it can lead to people being afraid of, like, just, like, for one thing, if you're doing a lot of time skips, very hard not to tell sometimes, because you need to show time passing. You can't, like, literally be showing every moment that unfolds in the whole book if the book spans a lot of time. But there's also just some really good writing that does tell. If the telling is compelling, then it doesn't bother me at all. The Haunting of Hill House, Chapter 2. It's a classic, but what happens in Chapter 2 of Hill House? It is just a description of people that we're going to meet in the book. Luke Sanderson was a liar. He was also a thief. His aunt, who was the owner of Hill House, was fond of pointing out that her nephew had the best education, the best clothes, the best taste, and the worst companions of anyone she had ever known. She would have leaped at any chance to put him safely away for a few weeks. Yeah, Shirley Jackson could have showed this, and it probably would have still been good, because she's a great writer. But I think that those couple of sentences were very compelling reading, and I did not feel like I needed to have them shown. Sometimes I just don't hate being told something if the prose is lively and interesting. It gives you a sense of, okay, the stage is set. Now we'll get on with it. Disheveled editing, what do you hear? I actually, in the course of working on this video, read The Valley of Amazement by Amy Tan. Oh my gosh, my hair is a mess. And that is a book that had a lot of telling, so it was an interesting one for me to pick up at this particular moment. But it also spans 40 years, so, you have to do some telling if you're going to span 40 years. And as I was reading it, and it was a real page turner. I read it in 4 days, and it's 500 something page book. I was really interested to see what parts she felt were worth showing in real time with real dialogue, as opposed to just telling us what happened. And I don't know how she made some of those decisions. I do feel like it pretty much worked for me. And that was a good example to me of how telling can really, really work. It had kind of a, I'm going to tell you this tale of my life kind of feeling to it. So that's why there's just no one rule you can go with here. But it is true that beginning writers often do overtell what characters are feeling or over-describe places that don't really have as lively writing or aren't as necessary and bog the story down. But this habit of trying to trim out your unnecessary telling can sometimes persist way too long once you've learned that show don't tell rule and you just keep showing too many things. It's fine to tell. Part of it is just styles of different eras, for one thing. And part of it is that you just need to know when to show and when to tell. Not that you actually shouldn't tell. The next one I hate, kill your darlings. This is another bit of advice that has just become so oversimplified that it sticks in your head. It could be wielded against you at some point by a critique partner. I had this experience in a critique group a long time ago where one of the members told me that my whole book just wasn't working and I need to stop writing it because I loved the characters too much, and his take was kind of the whole thing was a darling that needed to be killed. But the concept behind kill your darlings, I think, is generally comes from you've written a book and there's something in the book that you just really love, but it's not really working. And people who are reading it are kind of what's the point of this character or this plot line? And you're kind of they're so fun. That's kind of what it's supposed to mean. And in that way, it's not necessarily bad advice. You should be aware of the potential that you might need to kill your darlings, that they might not be working in the way that you had hoped, or that the way they're coming off to you, or you might sense that they're starting to not really work and starting to hamper your story, but you're just having a hard time letting go of them or seeing how you could revise the book to not have them, stuff like that. The problem is that when it becomes interpreted as just get rid of everything that is extraneous, or that, if a character isn't working, for example, that the only thing that you can do is to kill them. It feels very limiting to me. Especially if you have ever had someone tell you that you need to kill your darling. And the darling is something that is almost the whole point of why you wrote the book in the first place. Or is it your favorite part of the book? Don't murder your baby. But it should be more interpreted as it's possible that part of this isn't working, or it's not coming across in the way I hoped and I might need to change some things, or stuff like that. But I hate the phrase kill your darlings. And another common instance where people tell you to kill your darlings is the scene that doesn't really go anywhere but is just fun. And I think with the rise of indie publishing, we've seen that readers are actually often perfectly cool with a scene that doesn't advance the plot, as long as it's like fun and has character development or something. I don't think that you necessarily need to kill even a scene that doesn't add a whole lot, except that it's just fun. After all, anime and manga have a lot of extraneous scenes, and that's one of the things that I like about them. It just has to be well done. It just has to not lose the reader. That's really like the only rule, at least if the point is to have readers. Then there are the many don'ts. Do not write second person point of view. Do not write omniscient point of view. Do not start a fantasy with a prologue. Do not include dream sequences or flashbacks. There's a lot of these kind of don't do this. And I think what you really should know about these things is that they can be challenging to pull off. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do them. Just that be aware that you might need to put more work into figuring out how to make them work. And you may have less readers as a consequence, for example, of writing in the second person or a third person omniscient, which are less common point of views. Like third person omniscient used to be a lot more common than it is nowadays, but it's getting to be more of a rare point of view. And it's kind of a hard one to write for a lot of people, because third person omniscient is when you're basically telling the story as a narrator who is kind of telling it from the points of view of many different people, either close, like you're getting in their heads, or far, as in you're not really getting in anyone's heads, but you, the kind of author, are really the only true voice. That's a hard one to write. And prologues, a lot of people complain about fantasy prologues because they were just so overused. But I feel like you can do anything. You just need to write it in a way that people want to read it. That's kind of the main rule here, is that just be aware that certain choices may be more challenging. And if you actually want to have a lot of readers, you might need to work harder to make that aspect work. But not a lot of people choose like a second person point of view without having some deliberate reason for doing so. So, if that's what you want to do, it doesn't hurt to experiment at any stage if you really feel like it's important to the story. Write what you know. Write what you know. That's advice where I always think, who is that for? What is the context in which you say, write what you know? Like, we know that it's something you say to like a young person who's trying to write about like emotions that they have not experienced and maybe aren't doing a great job with, or somebody who's trying to write about a time and place that they don't know that much about without a lot of research. But like, those aren't cases where I would necessarily say, just write what you know. My question in that case would be, what is your reason for telling this story? And how can you get deeper into the root of it? Because write what you know is just so silly. Like, we're not all just going to write biographical fiction. We're not all going to write books set in places we've actually lived, or characters whose backgrounds match ours, or we're going to write about emotions that we haven't necessarily experienced in the same way. Like, otherwise it would be very limiting. So of course we're not all going to write what we know. So the question is, in what instance are we particularly telling people that they should write what they know? And why are we telling them that? I think those are the main reasons. Is if you are not conveying emotions very well because you've never experienced those things, or that you're doing a bad job with some kind of research about a character who isn't you because you don't know enough about their cultural background, where they come from, but the author has still chosen this story. So my question would always be, why did you choose this story? What are you trying to get at? And how can you get there in a more convincing way? Not just, go write what you know. Why are you writing this? Then we have the advice about beginnings, to begin with a hook or to begin just before the action starts. Now, if you've ever read a lot of beginning writers' writings all at once, you will kind of understand why this advice exists, because a fair amount of submissions begin in a really boring place. And I can certainly see why this advice is like, hey, instead of like telling us all this boring stuff, what if you began the story right before the action starts? But then you can also very much tell the authors that have had this advice drummed into them because they're the ones that start with some crazy thing happening. I thought it was going to be a normal day until I fell off the cliff. You know? Why is that my example? It's so stupid. This is kind of one of those instances where I can see the progression from the total beginner to the studied beginner to the actual, like, experienced writer, because the really beginning writers often begin with just, you know, the good old so-and-so was having a really rough day. She got out of bed, you know, the cliche, the day starts, the book starts. People do that. People begin books that way. Because I feel like a really confident hook is often not a big wowie kind of hook. It's the writing is good and there's just something that's a little bit interesting, and it can be pretty subtle, but it's just that kind of thing that makes you sit up a little bit straighter in your mind as you're reading and go, okay. And it is not an explosion or a murder or, you know, some crazy thing. I mean, unless, of course, the book actually calls for that kind of beginning. I think sometimes people kind of start to even plan their ideas around, like, oh my God, what's the crazy first line gonna be? And that just doesn't work for every kind of book. Don't be afraid to start more quietly. If the writing is good, it comes across as very confident, but you just want some implication that things will happen. That's really the big thing. Not that it actually literally has to start before a bomb goes off, but just that you're leading the reader down some kind of path that's going to go somewhere. On a similar note, there's the advice to have tension on every page, or think of the worst thing that could happen to your main character and then do that to them. This is probably one of my least favorite pieces of advice ever. It's great maybe if you want a book that is just a total thrill ride page turner, but a lot of books are not like that. When I used to write under the idea that I had to have tension on every page, and I did write like this for quite a while, I felt like I never gave my characters room to really develop. They can never breathe. They can never just have fun. The pacing was just way too fast because I felt like tension on every page. That means that somebody's always arguing or fighting or something bad is happening. There's always the implication that, like, there's going to be something bad all the time. But the kind of books that I like to read are not like that. Why did I feel like I have to write this way? I like books that are more comforting. Now, you do have to have a sense that something is happening and that some of those things are bad. But sometimes positive developments that are not tense are just as satisfying as the tension and the worst thing that could possibly happen to your main character. You really just want change and forward momentum of some kind, and it can be pretty subtle too, especially if you have a scene that's just like, you know, it's delightful. You're describing like some fun foods or the characters are bantering. You know, if you're giving the reader something that's like really enjoyable and scratches a different kind of itch, if that's the kind of story you're telling, you don't need to have a lot of change going on. You just need to bear in mind that the book should not sit in one place for very long. But books move at different paces, and tension on every page can often lead you on a like rollicking race through switchbacks, whereas your reader might have preferred very slow country carriage ride. Then there's the advice that to be a real writer, you should not write fluff, escapism, pulp, sexy books, work for hire, writing for money, any of that kind of super commercial stuff. This is one I just vehemently disagree with because I went through this experience of writing purely for money, and I honestly can say I learned so much about writing and became so much of a better author for having had that time. It was not my number one preference, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't learning things all along the way. And in fact, I think that sometimes throwing out your lofty expectations and kind of just writing what you think is like, this is kind of crap, it can really free you up. And there will be moments of what you feel is actually genius that will come out in your crap. It's also a really common thing for writers to do. I mean, Louisa May Alcott wrote a lot of that kind of stuff before she wrote Little Women, which is regarded as a classic. A lot of writers write very commercial stuff, and a lot of very commercial stuff ends up becoming classic. Most of it doesn't, of course, but that's also true of most quote-unquote good books as well. I also think there is a little bit of element of jealousy sometimes in some of that, because I certainly know from experience, writing what I love does not make as much money as writing very commercial romance novels. So if you're someone who feels like you just cannot stoop yourself to write that sort of thing, you can't for whatever reason, and that's not unusual. Not everyone can, even if you wanted to. It could make you a little testy sometimes. I mean, believe me, I wish I had been better at writing like alpha males who say, "Who hurt you?" because I would probably have made more money if I could. But there was just like a level of commercial writing I could not bring myself to do. Like, I just couldn't. Not even because like I really wanted to. I just couldn't. I really wanted to like just make that bank for a short amount of time, but I just I couldn't do it. So I get that, and it made me a little testy sometimes. Now, someone brought up as advice that they hate is that your first book will suck, so don't bother trying to make it good. I wanted to mention this one because I have often brought up the concept that your first book is going to suck. But I don't mean it from the perspective of don't try to make that book good. The only reason that I say this is simply to give you solidarity that like no one's first book, very few people write a good first book. And at some point you probably are going to have to let it go. And not in a way in that it was published, but just to let go of it. And you might be able to come back to it. Like, you might not be letting it go forever. But probably the first manuscript is not good, and you're going to have to go through the process of letting that one go and working on something else and not getting too precious about the first book. But I'm only bringing that up just to, let you know how common this experience is and not to feel bad about it when it happens. And once in a while, it doesn't. Once in a while, people write a really, really great first book. Just, most of us don't. I certainly didn't. So I like to prepare people for the idea that, think about the next thing and don't be afraid to change it up and to grow as a writer. And, you might not be killing that darling forever, but you're going to come back to it with a different perspective after you've written your second book. That's the only reason I'm saying it. I do think you should make the first book as good as you can at that time. That's how you improve. And you never know. It might actually be great. And the last advice I want you to ignore is to not follow advice, but to go with your gut. Having said all this about all this advice that I don't want you to take, it is important to understand why this advice exists. That is the main thing that I would urge writers to do, is to study the why of the advice, even perhaps more than the advice itself. But the why, and does any of this apply to your manuscript? Because chances are some of these common things are things that are not really going to quite fit what you're doing, but some of them are. And that's why you study the why of the advice. But having done that, you have to get the work out there into the real world, to real readers. You have to finish things and let people read it, whether they're your friends or your critique partners or agents you send to. It's in the process of actually creating things and sharing them and seeing what the feedback is that you will start to feel out what works for you and what is not working for you, and what you might need to work on because it's not really connecting with people. They're not really getting what you're trying to do, or they're kind of bored by this thing. And that's where you can think about some of this advice and understand, oh, okay, I get why this isn't working because I didn't really start my book in the right place. Or I get why this isn't working because I'm really telling the reader what my main character feels on every page. But just as equally, there are some things you probably shouldn't listen to. You might have the type of book that really does need a prologue in the beginning, or you, like me, might find that having tension on every page does not really suit the kind of books that you want to write. It's good to just feel it out and see what works. Is there any other advice that I missed here, or do you have any other thoughts about what you think the actual best writing advice should be? Let me know in the comments. If you're new here, my name is Lydia Foxglove and I am a fantasy author. On this channel, I talk about the creative life in general and the writing life in particular. I've been both traditionally and indie published and have been making my living as a writer and creative since 2009. And if you'd like more from me, I have a members tier that's available on YouTube, Substack, and Patreon, where you get 2 bonus videos per month voted on by you guys and access to my Discord server where we chat about writing and other stuff every day. It's only $5 a month to join, and I'd love to see you there. If you'd like to read any of my books, there's a link in the description. My Hidden Lands books are the ones I recommend first because they are the books of my heart, but I also have romance novels, young adult, all kinds of stuff. I post every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!